The air was thick with the sweet scent of cotton candy and fried dough as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dancing shadows across the carnival grounds. The state fair was in full swing, a vibrant tapestry of color and sound. The carnival lights, a dazzling array of neon hues, illuminated the rides and attractions, drawing crowds of eager fairgoers. The midway was a bustling hub of activity, filled with the sounds of laughter, cheers, and the clanging of arcade games. The smell of sizzling food wafted through the air, enticing hungry patrons to indulge in their favorite fair delicacies. From funnel cakes and corn dogs to giant pretzels and candy apples, there was something to satisfy every craving. A Ferris wheel, its towering structure illuminated by twinkling lights, soared high above the crowd, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the fairgrounds. Nearby, a roller coaster, its tracks twisting and turning, sent riders on a thrilling adventure. The screams of joy and excitement filled the air as riders plunged down steep drops and soared through loops. Amidst the chaos and excitement, a sense of anticipation hung heavy in the air. The fairgoers were drawn to the carnival's allure, eager to experience the thrill of the rides, the taste of the food, and the magic of the atmosphere. As the night wore on, the fairgrounds became even more enchanting, a place where dreams could come true and the ordinary became extraordinary. Amidst the vibrant chaos of the fair, a figure stood apart. A tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a peculiar aura hovered near a seemingly ordinary haunted house dark ride. His attire, a worn, tattered suit that seemed to have seen better days, contrasted sharply with the colorful, festive atmosphere of the fair. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes held a strange, unsettling intensity. A peculiar, almost hypnotic quality emanated from the man. His voice, deep and resonant, carried a hint of menace that seemed to cut through the din of the fair. He stood at the entrance to the haunted house, his gaze fixed on the passing crowd. "Step inside," he invited, his voice a low, seductive whisper. "Enter a world of darkness and terror, a place that will drive you mad." The haunted house, unlike the other attractions, seemed shrouded in an eerie, unnatural gloom. Its facade was adorned with grotesque, twisted faces carved into the wood, and the windows were pitch black, offering no glimpse of what lay within. A few brave souls ventured into the haunted house, drawn by the Barkers' tantalizing invitation. But as they emerged, their faces were pale and their eyes wide with fear. They spoke of chilling encounters with ghostly apparitions, spine-tingling sounds, and a pervasive sense of dread. Despite the warnings, Jacob, captivated by the Barkers' enigmatic presence and the promise of a thrilling experience, decided to enter the haunted house. As he stepped through the darkened doorway, a shiver ran down their spine. The Barkers' eyes followed them, a cold, calculating gleam in his gaze. Jacob hesitated at the entrance to the haunted house, his heart pounding in his chest. The Barkers' words echoed in his mind. "Enter a world of darkness and terror, a place that will drive you mad." Despite the warnings from others, he felt a strange compulsion to step inside. The Barkers' eyes seemed to bore into Jacob, his gaze filled with a knowing intensity. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "Fear is a powerful emotion. It can drive you to the brink of madness." Jacob swallowed hard, his fear momentarily forgotten. He was drawn to the mystery and the thrill of the unknown. With a deep breath, he stepped through the darkened doorway. As Jacob entered the haunted house, the world outside seemed to fade away. The air was cold and damp, and the only sounds were the creaking of floorboards and the distant dripping of water. The darkness was absolute, save for the occasional flicker of light that seemed to dance and shift in the shadows. Jacob pressed on, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned a corner and found himself in a dimly lit hallway. The walls were adorned with strange, grotesque symbols, and the air was filled with a sense of unease. He heard a faint whisper, as if someone were calling his name. As Jacob continued to explore the haunted house, he encountered a series of terrifying encounters. A ghostly figure appeared before him, its face contorted in a mask of horror. A disembodied voice whispered chilling threats in his ear. A sudden blast of cold air sent shivers down his spine. Jacob's fear grew with each passing moment. He felt as if he were trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the horrors that surrounded him. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the dark ride vehicle lurched forward, plunging him into the heart of the haunted house. The darkness was absolute, save for the occasional flicker of light that seemed to dance and shift in the shadows. The air was thick with a musty scent of decay, and the only sounds were the creaking of the ride and the distant dripping of water. The ride twisted and turned, taking Jacob through a series of eerie chambers. At one point, he found himself in a dimly lit hallway lined with grotesque, twisted faces carved into the walls. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers down his spine. As the ride continued, Jacob's fear grew. He caught glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corners, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. A disembodied voice whispered chilling threats in his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. Suddenly, the ride came to a screeching halt. Jacob found himself in a small, circular room. The walls were adorned with strange, alien symbols, and the air was thick with a heavy, oppressive silence. A faint glow emanated from a small, circular opening in the ceiling. A sense of dread washed over Jacob as he realized he was trapped. The haunted house had become his prison, and there seemed to be no escape. As he looked up at the opening in the ceiling, he felt a wave of panic. He was alone, surrounded by darkness and the unknown, and he had no idea what awaited him. As Jacob stared up at the circular opening in the ceiling, a sense of dread washed over him. He was trapped, alone in the heart of the haunted house, with no way out. The darkness seemed to close in around him, and the silence was broken only by the faint drip of water and the occasional creak of the old ride. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers down Jacob's spine. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of a way out. But there was nothing. The walls were solid, and the opening in the ceiling seemed to be too high to reach. Suddenly, a faint light flickered on at the far end of the room. Jacob's heart pounded as he strained to see what was causing it. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form distorted and misshapen. It was a grotesque creature, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp teeth. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its voice echoing through the room. It lunged at Jacob, its claws outstretched. Jacob ducked just in time, avoiding the creature's grasp. He scrambled backwards, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature continued to pursue Jacob, its movements swift and agile. Jacob dodged and weaved, desperately trying to find a way to escape. But the creature was relentless, closing in on him with every passing moment. Just when it seemed as if Jacob was cornered, the creature stopped. It turned its head towards the door, its eyes filled with a strange, almost human-like intelligence. Then, without warning, it vanished into the darkness. Jacob was left alone in the room, trembling with fear. He didn't know what had happened to the creature, but he knew he couldn't stay there. He had to find a way out. With renewed determination, Jacob began to search the room for a hidden door or a secret passage. He explored every inch of the room, but there was nothing. Just when he was about to give up hope, he noticed a small, circular symbol carved into the floor. Jacob knelt down and examined the symbol. It was strange and unfamiliar, but it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. He reached out and touched it, and to his surprise, the floor beneath him began to move. Suddenly, the ride lurched to a stop. The darkness was momentarily pierced by a shaft of light as the doors of the haunted house creaked open. Jacob hesitated, his mind racing. He could feel the cold, clammy air of the haunted house seeping into his bones. With a deep breath, Jacob forced himself to move. He stumbled out of the haunted house, his legs trembling. The bright light of the fair seemed almost blinding after the darkness of the ride. He looked back at the haunted house, a mix of relief and dread washing over him. As he made his way through the fair, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The once vibrant atmosphere seemed subdued, almost eerie. People avoided his gaze, their faces etched with a strange, unspoken fear. Jacob decided to head back to the entrance of the fair, hoping to find a way to leave. As he walked, he noticed that the haunted house seemed to be shrinking. It was as if it were being absorbed into the ground, leaving behind only a small, circular patch of disturbed earth. A chill ran down Jacob's spine. He had a feeling that this was not the end of his ordeal. The haunted house might be gone, but the terror it had unleashed was far from over. Part 8. The Denial. The next day, Jacob returned to the fair, determined to convince himself that the haunted house ride had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. He walked through the fair, his eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces. He remembered the carnival barker, the tall, gaunt man with the unsettling eyes. But there was no sign of him. Jacob approached the spot where the haunted house had been the previous day. To his surprise, the ride was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever existed. The ground was smooth and undisturbed, as if the haunted house had never been there. Jacob was stunned. He couldn't believe it. Had he really imagined the entire thing? Had the haunted house been a figment of his imagination? He shook his head, trying to dispel the doubt. He knew he hadn't imagined it. He had felt the fear, the terror, the cold, clammy air of the haunted house. It had been real. As Jacob wandered through the fair, he tried to piece together the events of the previous day. He remembered the strange occurrences, the ghostly figures, the disembodied voices. He had been so terrified, so convinced that he was trapped in a nightmare. But now, as he looked around at the bustling fair, he began to wonder if he had been the only one to experience such horrors. Jacob decided to ask a few people about the haunted house. He approached a group of teenagers who were standing near a cotton candy stand. "Hey, do you remember the haunted house ride that was here yesterday?" he asked. The teenagers exchanged puzzled glances. "Haunted house ride?" One of them said. "I don't remember seeing any haunted house ride." Jacob was taken aback. "Are you sure? It was right over there, near the Ferris wheel." "Nope, I don't think there was anything there," the teenager replied. Jacob tried asking a few more people, but he got the same response. No one seemed to remember the haunted house ride. It was as if it had never existed. Jacob's confusion deepened as he realized that no one seemed to remember the haunted house ride. He decided to try one last time, approaching a man who was running a carnival game across the street from where the haunted house had been. As Jacob wandered through the fair, his confusion deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The haunted house ride had been real. He was sure of it. But why couldn't anyone else remember it? And what had happened to it? Determined to find answers, Jacob began to pay closer attention to his surroundings. He noticed that some of the carnival workers seemed familiar, as if he had seen them the day before. He approached a group of workers who were setting up a game near the entrance. "Excuse me," Jacob said. "Did you see the haunted house ride yesterday?" The workers exchanged puzzled glances. "Haunted house ride?" One of them said. "We don't remember seeing anything like that." Jacob persisted. "Are you sure? It was right over there, near the Ferris wheel." The workers shook their heads, their expressions unchanged. "No, I don't think there was anything there," one of them replied. Jacob was growing increasingly frustrated. He knew he wasn't imagining things. He had seen the haunted house ride with his own eyes. But why couldn't anyone else remember it? As he continued to walk through the fair, Jacob spotted a man who he was sure he had seen working a game across from the haunted house the previous day. He approached the man, his heart pounding with anticipation. "Excuse me," Jacob said. "Do you remember the haunted house ride that was over there yesterday?" The man looked at Jacob with a blank expression. "Haunted house ride?" he replied. "I don't recall seeing anything like that." Jacob persisted. "Your game was right across from the haunted house." The man shook his head. "No, I don't think there was anything there. That whole row was just games." Jacob was at a loss. He had seen the haunted house ride with his own eyes, but it was as if it had never existed. It was as if he had imagined the whole thing. The strange occurrences didn't end when Jacob left the fair. As soon as he returned home, he began to notice a peculiar chill in the air. It wasn't the kind of cold that could be explained by a drafty window or a faulty thermostat. It was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He also heard unsettling sounds coming from all corners of the house. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, even when he knew he was alone. Doors seemed to open and close on their own, and the wind howled through the house, even when there was no wind outside. At night, Jacob found it increasingly difficult to sleep. He would wake up with a start, convinced that he was being watched. He would feel a cold draft on the back of his neck, or hear a faint whisper in the darkness. The more Jacob tried to ignore the strange occurrences, the more persistent they became. He began to feel a sense of dread, a fear that something sinister was lurking in the shadows of his home. He tried to convince himself that he was just imagining things, that the stress of the fair had gotten to him. But deep down he knew that something was amiss. One night, as Jacob lay awake in bed, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the attic. He sat up and listened intently. The scratching grew louder, as if something was clawing at the ceiling. Fear gripped Jacob as he realized that the haunted house might not have been a figment of his imagination. Perhaps the evil that had haunted that place was now following him home. Jacob tossed and turned in his bed, his sleep disturbed by a recurring nightmare. In the dream, he was back in the haunted house, trapped in its labyrinth of terror. The ghostly figures, the eerie whispers, the suffocating darkness, it all came flooding back to him. He tried to scream, to wake up, but his voice was trapped, his body paralyzed. Finally, with a jolt, Jacob awoke. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he was drenched in sweat. He lay there for a moment, trying to calm himself. The nightmare felt so real, so vivid. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a dream. As Jacob lay in the darkness, he heard a faint whisper, as if someone were speaking directly into his ear. He listened intently, his breath held. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It was the voice of the carnival barker, the same voice he had heard at the fair. "You thought you could escape, Jacob?" the voice taunted. "You thought you could leave behind the horrors you've witnessed? Think again." Jacob's blood ran cold. He sat up in bed, his eyes wide with fear. The voice was real, not a product of his imagination. The carnival barker was still out there, and he was coming for Jacob. "The terror is not over," the voice continued. "It has only just begun. Prepare yourself for the ultimate nightmare." Jacob felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew that the haunted house had not been a dream. The evil that had haunted that place was now following him, and there was no escape. The voice faded away, leaving Jacob alone in the darkness. He lay there for a long time, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself that it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, he knew that the voice was real, and that the terror was far from over. Haunted by the carnival barker's chilling words, Jacob felt compelled to return to the fair. He knew it was a dangerous decision, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to confront the mysterious entity that had haunted him. The fair was in full swing, the atmosphere as vibrant and chaotic as ever. But for Jacob, it was a place of dread. He remembered the haunted house, the terrifying encounters, the eerie whispers. As he walked through the fair, he felt a sense of unease, as if he were being watched. Jacob searched the fairgrounds for any sign of the carnival barker, but there was no trace of him. The haunted house ride was still gone, and no one seemed to remember it ever being there. Desperate to find the barker, Jacob approached one of the fair organizers. He explained his encounter with the mysterious figure and the strange occurrences that had followed. The organizer listened patiently, but when Jacob finished, his expression remained unchanged. "I'm sorry, sir," the organizer said. "I haven't heard anything about a carnival barker or a haunted house ride." Jacob was at a loss. He knew he wasn't imagining things. The haunted house had been real, and the carnival barker had threatened him. But it seemed as if no one else could remember them. As Jacob wandered through the fair, he felt a growing sense of despair. He was alone, facing an unseen enemy that seemed determined to torment him. But he refused to give up. He would find the carnival barker no matter what it took. As Jacob wandered through the fair, his heart heavy with despair, he felt a chill run down his spine. He turned around, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the carnival barker. That was when he saw him, standing at the exact spot where the haunted house had once been. The barker stood there, his gaunt figure silhouetted against the setting sun. His eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and a sinister smile played on his lips. Jacob felt a wave of fear wash over him. He knew that his confrontation with the mysterious entity was finally about to begin. As Jacob approached the barker, the man's smile widened. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "It seems you've finally returned." Jacob tried to remain calm, but his heart was pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The barker laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Jacob's spine. "Oh, I'm many things, Jacob. A ghost, a phantom, a harbinger of doom." Jacob felt a sense of dread wash over him. He knew that he was facing something truly evil, something that defied explanation. "Why are you doing this to me?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. The barker's smile grew even wider. "Because it's fun," he replied. "It's always fun to watch someone suffer." Jacob felt a surge of anger. He had had enough. He stepped closer to the barker, his fists clenched. "You're going to pay for what you've done," he vowed. The barker laughed again, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating gleam. "We'll see about that," he said. And with that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Jacob's blood ran cold as he watched the carnival barker disappear into the crowd. He knew he had to act quickly. He had to confront the mysterious entity and put an end to the torment he had endured. With a surge of determination, Jacob gave chase. He pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes scanning the fairgrounds for any sign of the barker. The man was elusive, slipping through the throngs of people with ease. Jacob lost sight of the barker for a moment, his heart sinking. He scanned the crowd, his eyes darting from person to person. Just when he was about to give up hope, he caught a glimpse of the barker's distinctive figure. He was weaving through the crowd, his movements quick and agile. Jacob followed the barker, his legs burning with exertion. The man seemed to know the fairgrounds like the back of his hand, dodging and weaving through the crowds with ease. Jacob tried to keep up, but the barker was always just out of reach. As Jacob chased the barker through the fair, he noticed that people were beginning to stare at him. They seemed confused and alarmed, as if they couldn't understand why he was running. Jacob ignored their stares, his focus solely on the man he was pursuing. The barker led Jacob through a maze of rides and stalls, his movements becoming increasingly erratic. Jacob was beginning to tire, but he refused to give up. He knew that if he lost sight of the barker, he might never find him again. Just as Jacob was about to give up, he caught a glimpse of the barker disappearing behind a stall. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, he followed. Jacob burst through the narrow passageway behind the stall, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the area, his eyes searching for any sign of the carnival barker. But the man was nowhere to be seen. Jacob turned a corner, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the barker. But the man was nowhere to be seen. Jacob's heart sank. He had lost him. Desperate to find the barker, Jacob continued to search the fairgrounds. He checked every stall, every ride, every nook and cranny. But there was no sign of the mysterious figure. As darkness began to fall, casting long, eerie shadows across the fairgrounds, Jacob realized that he was alone. The carnival barker had vanished, leaving no trace behind. A sense of dread washed over Jacob. He had been so close to confronting the mysterious entity that had haunted him, but now it seemed as if he would never see him again. He wandered through the fair, his mind racing. What had happened to the barker? Where had he gone? As Jacob made his way towards the exit of the fair, he noticed a strange, circular pattern etched into the ground. It was the same pattern he had seen in the haunted house. A chill ran down his spine. He knew that the carnival barker was still out there, somewhere, and that his torment was far from over. As Jacob walked towards the exit of the fair, a chill ran down his spine. He felt as if he were being watched, as if something sinister was lurking in the shadows. He turned around, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the carnival barker. But there was no trace of him. A sense of dread washed over Jacob. He knew that the carnival barker was still out there, somewhere, and that his torment was far from over. He quickened his pace, anxious to leave the fair behind. Just as Jacob reached the exit, he heard a faint whisper, as if someone were speaking directly into his ear. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. "Remember what I told you?" the voice said. "I said the ride would drive you mad." Jacob turned around, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the carnival barker. But there was no one there. The voice was in his head, a chilling reminder of the torment he had endured. Suddenly, the world around Jacob began to fade. The lights dimmed, the sounds of the fair grew distant. A fog rolled in, obscuring everything. When the fog cleared, Jacob found himself standing in an empty field. He looked around, disoriented and confused. Where was the fair? Where had he gone? As he turned to leave, he saw a lone, dilapidated house perched on a hill in the distance. It looked eerily familiar, like the entrance to the haunted house ride. A chill ran down Jacob's spine. He began to walk towards the house, his legs feeling heavy and leaden. As he got closer, he noticed that the house was smaller than he remembered, almost like a playhouse. Jacob hesitated, his mind racing. Had he really been in a fair? Or had this entire experience been a dream, a hallucination? As he reached the house, he noticed a small, circular symbol carved into the door. It was the same symbol he had seen in the haunted house. A wave of dread washed over him. He knew that he was trapped, that the nightmare was far from over. Jacob reached out and touched the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty hallway. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. As he disappeared into the darkness, Jacob could hear the carnival barker's voice, echoing in his mind. "Welcome back," the voice said. "The ride has just begun." Jacob's heart sank. He knew that he was trapped, that he was about to experience the ultimate nightmare. And as he stepped further into the darkness, he wondered if this was real or he really was crazy.